Look at this. A dead-looking brown lump, about the size of a chestnut. Ugly. Forgettable. In the winter of 1636, a single one of these could be worth more than a merchant's house on the finest canal in the city. One flower bulb, for the price of a home. Some were said to change hands for more than 10 times what a skilled craftsman earned in a year, traded for oxen, pigs, silver, whole harvests of grain. And then, in a single week in February, the same bulb was worth almost nothing at all. This is the 17th century Dutch Republic at the height of its golden age, and the story people call the first great financial bubble in history. You've probably heard it used as a warning ever since. But stay with me to the end, because the strangest twist isn't how crazy it got. It's that most of what you've been told about it may not actually be true. This is the story of tulip mania, the bubble that became a legend, and the legend that grew far bigger than the bubble. By the end of this video, you'll understand how the first great speculative frenzy actually worked, and why nearly everything you've heard about it deserves a second look. If that's your kind of history, subscribe. There's a new story here every single week. To understand the madness, you first have to understand the flower, because the tulip was never an ordinary plant. It wasn't even European. The tulip came from the Ottoman Empire, carried west in the 1500s, first to Vienna, then, by the 1590s, into a botanical garden in the Dutch city of Leiden. And it arrived at the perfect moment. The Dutch Republic was becoming the richest trading nation on earth, its merchants swimming in new money and looking for beautiful ways to show it. An exotic flower from the east was exactly what new wealth loves to own. But not just any tulip. The prized ones were the broken tulips, petals streaked with wild flames and feathers of color, like the legendary Semper Augustus, white lit up with tongues of crimson. No two were quite alike. They looked like living works of art. And here is the strange secret at the heart of the whole story. Those flame patterns were caused by a disease, a virus spread from plant to plant by aphids, that broke the flower's color into those spectacular streaks. And that same virus weakened the bulb. It made the plant reproduce slowly, each generation more stunted than the last. So the most breathtaking tulips in the world were also the ones almost impossible to multiply. Think about what that creates. Real, biological scarcity, attached to an object of pure status. There would only ever be a handful. Something rare, beautiful, suddenly wanted by everyone, and impossible to make more of. The perfect fuel for a mania. All it needed was a spark. And in the 1630s, it caught fire. At first, the trade made sense. Wealthy collectors paid high prices for rare bulbs, the way people pay for fine art. But then it did something that turns any market into a machine. It stopped being about flowers. Because here's the problem. A tulip bulb spends most of the year underground, invisible. You can only dig it up in summer. So through autumn and winter, no actual bulbs could change hands. Instead, people traded paper, contracts, promises to deliver a bulb next spring. And those promises could be bought and sold all winter long, in taverns, among informal little clubs the Dutch nicknamed colleges. A single contract might be resold a dozen times before one flower ever bloomed. The Dutch had a perfect name for it. The windhandel, the wind trade. Trading in air. And once you're trading paper promises, you don't need to love tulips, or even tell one bulb from another. You only need to believe one thing. That tomorrow, someone will pay you more than you paid today. Weavers, bakers, craftsmen, ordinary people with a little savings, began buying in. Each new buyer pushed the price up, and every rising price pulled in the next. Prices climbed because everyone expected them to climb. That expectation was the entire engine. By the winter of 1636, the numbers had left the planet. A single Semper Augustus was said to fetch as much as 10,000 guilders, enough to buy one of the grand merchant houses lining the canals of Amsterdam. One bulb, one mansion. Another famous account lists a single viceroy bulb traded for a small fortune of goods, wagon loads of grain, for fat oxen, 8 pigs, a dozen sheep, wine, beer, butter, cheese, a bed, a suit of clothes, and a silver cup. Here's the problem with that number, with all of these numbers. They are real quotes, written down at the time. But most come from a small handful of moralizing pamphlets, copied and recopied for centuries. And something more important hides underneath them. In the wind trade, the money had mostly not changed hands yet. These were promises for delivery in the spring. On paper, everyone was getting richer. In their pockets, almost nothing had moved. The price on the contract and the money in the room were two completely different things. And that gap is about to matter more than anything else in this story. For 3 years, the wind trade rose. In the final months, it went nearly vertical, prices multiplying week by week. And then, in the first days of February 1637, it stopped. The story goes that it happened in the city of Haarlem. At a routine auction, a seller offered his bulbs, and for the first time, no one bid. In a market built entirely on the belief that the next person would always pay more, a single missing buyer is all it takes. The moment that belief cracks, there is nothing underneath. Within weeks, a bulb that had been worth a house was worth almost nothing, because worth, here, had only ever been a shared story. And now came the reckoning. Except it didn't look like you'd expect. All those winter contracts, those promises to buy bulbs at sky-high prices, buyers simply refused to honor them. And they could. Under Dutch law, these forward deals had always been on shaky ground, almost unenforceable. In February 1637, the authorities effectively turned the contracts into options. You no longer had to buy. You could walk away by paying a small fraction of the price. Town by town, they haggled over that fraction, 10%, then in Haarlem, 3.5%. And in the end, most of the contracts were simply never honored at all. Which raises a question the legend never quite answers. If almost nobody actually paid these insane prices, who, exactly, was ruined? For almost 200 years, the answer everyone gave came from one book, a Scottish writer named Charles Mackay, who in 1841 turned tulip mania into the definitive tale of a nation gone mad. The ruined nobles, the bankrupt merchants, people throwing themselves into the canals, the famous sailor who ate a priceless bulb, mistaking it for an onion, and was jailed for it. It's a wonderful story. It's just not really history. Because in 2007, a historian named Anne Goldgar did something almost nobody had bothered to do. She went into the actual Dutch archives, the notary records, the court cases, the account books, and counted. And what she found quietly dismantles the legend. The trade was real, but small, and confined to a fairly tight circle of wealthy merchants and skilled craftsmen. Not the whole nation, not the peasants, not everyone. Of the people she could trace, fewer than half a dozen ran into real financial trouble, and even for those, it's not clear the tulips were to blame. There was no wave of bankruptcies, no bodies in the canals. The sailor and his onion? Almost certainly invented. Tulip bulbs taste foul and can make you sick. And remember the wind trade. Because the money had mostly never changed hands, and the contracts were mostly never honored, the crash didn't actually vaporize many real fortunes. You can't lose a fortune you were only ever promised on paper. So where did the panic in those pamphlets come from? Goldgar's answer is the most interesting part. They weren't written by ruined victims. They were mostly written by moralists and preachers, men who saw in the tulip craze a lesson about greed, about worshipping earthly beauty instead of heavenly virtue. The real damage wasn't financial. It was subtler, a shock to trust itself. A society that ran on personal honor and a man's word had just watched thousands of people break their promises without consequence. What tulip mania really wrecked wasn't the Dutch economy. It was, for a moment, the Dutch sense of what a promise was worth. So let's be honest about both halves, because both are real. Yes, this was a genuine speculative frenzy. Prices for rare bulbs really did reach absurd multiples of a year's wages. The wind trade really did inflate, and really did collapse, suddenly, in February 1637. That part is not a myth. But the rest, the ruined nation, the mass suicides, the economy brought to its knees, that was a story built on top of a much smaller event, inflated over the centuries far more dramatically than any tulip ever was. Modern historians who catalog the great financial bubbles now often leave tulip mania off the list entirely. Too small, too contained, too little real damage. And yet here's what's remarkable. Nearly 400 years later, tulip mania is still the first thing we reach for whenever a price runs wild. A new stock, a new technology, a new asset nobody quite understands. Which leaves a genuinely interesting question hanging in the air. Do we keep repeating the tulip story because it teaches us something true about crowds and greed, or because a good legend is simply too useful to fact-check? If you want the full human version of this story, the flowers, the growers, the plague, the whole strange world behind the mania, it's told in the book linked in the description. Strip away the flowers, and tulip mania follows a pattern you'll see again and again on this channel. Take a rare and desirable object. Turn its price into a story about what the next person will pay. Watch that story lift ordinary people off the ground and fall the instant they stop believing. And then, long after the dust settles, watch the tale itself keep growing, retold and exaggerated until the myth stands taller than anything that really happened. Money, in the end, is a story a nation tells itself, and so, it turns out, is the history of money. Next time on Paper Empires, we go to a country where the money didn't become too valuable. It became so worthless that families burned it for heat, because banknotes were literally cheaper than firewood. That's the story of the Weimar hyperinflation, and it's next. This is Paper Empires, the wildest true stories of money, markets, and the economies that shaped our world. If this is your kind of history, subscribe. The next story is already on the way.